Clara's boots sank into the damp undergrowth as she followed the narrow trail towards Blackwater Falls. The forest canopy wove an intricate lattice above her head, filtering stray beams of waning sunlight into ghostly patterns on the mossy ground. Each breath she took felt laden with the promise of secrets long buried under centuries of rot and vine. She relished the hush that had settled over the woods, broken only by the distant rhythmic thunder of water slipping over stone. The scent of wet pine hung heavy in the air, trailing behind her like a silent companion, and she found herself wondering if she truly welcomed the solitude or feared it. As Clara reached the crest of a small rise, the roar of the falls greeted her like a tempest unleashed. White spray danced on the breeze, weaving through the trees with uncanny grace, and her pulse quickened at the raw, elemental power before her. Below, the churning pool swallowed light and sound, creating a hollow hush that pressed against her ears. A sudden breeze whisked past, carrying a faint pleading murmur that sounded almost human. She paused, head tilted, listening for a voice that might have been imagined, yet felt heartbreakingly real. The first light of dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and sickly oranges as Clara descended toward the water's edge. The trail narrowed, hemmed in by twisting roots that groped at her ankles like arthritic fingers. At times she stumbled, catching herself on the rough bark of ancient oaks, whose limbs arched overhead like looming sentinels. In her pack, her simple camping gear rattled softly. She had planned only a short overnight stay, a chance to recharge her spirit after months of relentless noise in the city. She never anticipated the city would follow her here. Clara found the cabin when the last sliver of daylight dipped behind the forest's crest. Its weathered boards leaned at odd angles, and the windows, dusty and opaque, reflected her approach as though a pair of watchful eyes. She hesitated at the threshold, the roar of the falls now louder, more insistent. Something in her chest tightened. For a moment she considered turning back, but curiosity urged her forward. The door groaned as she pushed it open, and the darkness inside seemed to inhale her presence. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A sagging cot, a rickety table, and a single lantern without fuel. Cobwebs draped every surface like spectral veils. The air was cool and stale, carrying with it the faint musk of mold and decay. Clara set down her pack, then stepped to the window, wiping away grime to peer out at the swirling mist beyond. In the gloom, she thought she saw movement. A pale shape drifting along the treetops only to blink and find herself exposed to her own reflection. Shaken, she lit a small candle she carried and placed it on the table, determined to reclaim some sense of control. Night settled quickly, and the fall's thunder seemed to swell, drowning out all else. Clara lay awake on the cot, listening to the walls creak and sigh under the weight of darkness. Somewhere outside, branches scraped against the cabin's weathered siding, like skeletal fingers testing the barrier between the living and the dead. She told herself it was the wind, but every scrape echoed in her mind as a warning. She closed her eyes, fighting the urge to flee, yet sleep evaded her, leaving her stranded in the uneasy borderland between wakefulness and dream. Hours later, though in that restless vigil time felt meaningless, Clara was jolted upright by the abrupt clatter of her water bottle skidding across the floor. She snatched up the candle and crept toward the noise, heart pounding. The bottle lay by the open door, as though it had wanted to make its escape. She exhaled, forcing a laugh at her own jumpiness. Storm clouds rumbled overhead, and the tension in the air vibrated with the promise of rain. Gathering her courage, she secured the door against the gathering wind, unaware that the real storm was only just beginning. The wind rose to a howl, rattling the cabin and flinging rain against the shutters. Clara knelt at the window, watching beads of water race across the glass, distorting the view of the falls into a roiling blur. Through the downpour, she thought she heard voices, soft, almost pleading. Straining closer, she recognized murmurs of desperation. Far-off echoes of laughter twisted into cries. They seemed to beckon her, inviting her to step outside and join them. Her skin prickled with unease, and she stepped back, crossing herself reflexively, even though she was not certain what exactly she feared. Dawn arrived weak and reluctant, as though the sky itself had hesitated at the edges of night. Clara emerged into a world washed in ghostly grey, the storm still thrumming in the distance. She retrieved her gear, aware that every item she unzipped from her pack might disappear if she turned her back. Sure enough, when she returned, the small kettle she had unpacked was gone. No sign of disturbance in the leaves. Only a smooth patch of damp earth bore witness to its sudden departure. Clara swallowed hard, realizing there was no logical explanation. Something in these woods was watching, moving, claiming. Determined not to submit to fear, Clara ventured to explore the area around the cabin. Shivering under her rain jacket, she trod carefully along the mossy stones leading to the lip of the falls. Each step echoed in the hush, as if her footfalls were amplified by the forest's ancient emptiness. She shone her flashlight into the swirling mist, half expecting to find a huddled figure or a frantic shadow. But the only shapes were the crooked silhouettes of trees and the relentless white fury of the water below. Yet the calls persisted, carried on the breeze soft at first, then urgent. By midday, the storm had faded to a memory, leaving the forest saturated and dripping. Clara returned to the cabin, soaked through despite her efforts. Across its wooden face, she noticed fresh claw marks, deep and ragged, gouged into the wall beside the door. She counted 7 8 rivulets of splintered wood. They led upward as though something had tried to claw its way inside. Her breath caught. Whoever or whatever had done this was strong and determined. She scoured the surrounding ground for prints, but the rain had obliterated any trace of passage. It was as if the forest itself refused proof of intrusion. That night, Clara barricaded herself in the cabin's interior, using her pack and spare logs to shore up the door. She seated herself on the cot, knees drawn close, and held the candle like a fragile talisman against the dark. The fall's roar had settled into a bass note, a constant reminder of her isolation. In the far corners of the room, shadows writhed and stretched. Behind her, the walls groaned as if shifting. She dared not look at the windows. The few she had glanced through earlier revealed pale faces pressed against the dirty glass, their eyes vacant and hollow. Now she refused to meet their gaze. Hours later, a faint tapping roused her from a doze. Tap, tap, tap like a rhythmic warning. Clara stiffened, listening as the sound drifted along the wall. She stood and crept toward the noise, candle lifted before her. At the doorway, an open panel dripped rainwater onto the threshold, but the tapping came from above. Heart in her throat, Clara traced the sound to the loft hatch. Someone or something was moving in the attic. She climbed the narrow ladder, each rung protesting under her weight. At the top, she swallowed and peered into gloom. The candlelight flickered, and for a moment she glimpsed the outline of a small figure, too swift to catch. A gust of wind slammed the cabin door shut below with a deafening bang, startling Clara so fiercely she lost her balance. The candle plunged from her grasp, igniting a brief flare before guttering out in the wet air. She flailed, desperately grasping at the loft's edge and pulling herself upright in sudden darkness. Panic seized her throat as something scuttled just beyond the edge of light, too swift to see, but heavy enough to shift boards beneath its weight. She backed away, hands searching blindly until it found the ladder. Without pausing, she scrambled down, steeling herself to face whatever waited below. The cabin felt colder when she reached the ground. Clara stumbled toward the table where her candle lay extinguished, and her fingers found the box of matches in her pocket. Kneeling, she struck one, and a thin flame sprang to life. Relief washed over her, though it was tinged with dread. In the flickering glow, she saw the floor littered with her scattered belongings: clothes, robes, tools, each item strewn as though tossed by invisible hands. She exhaled, hands trembling, and gathered what she could. The water bottle that had skidded away the first night lay cracked open, its contents lost to the floorboards. She spent the rest of the night huddled by the tiny fire she built in the hearth, eyes fixed on the dancing light. Outside, the trees swayed, branches scratching against each other in a sound that might have been laughter or tears. Clara kept her pack close, hand never more than an inch from the small knife at her belt. She whispered gentle encouragement to herself, repeating her own name to stave off the creeping terror that threatened to swallow her. By the time dawn threatened to break, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into an uneasy slumber on the cot, still clutching the knife. Awakening to silence was more alarming than any storm. Clara opened her eyes to find the cabin oddly still. No roar of water, no tapping, no branches scritching at the walls. She blinked, trying to orient herself. The lantern she had left on the table was missing, and in its place a single white feather lay, damp and delicate. She picked it up, its softness incongruous with the terror of the past nights. Anger flared within her. If this was some elaborate trick, she would not be its victim. She resolved to leave at first light, though every instinct whispered that escape might be impossible. Clara packed quickly, her fingers shaking as she shoved her gear into the pack. She left behind the cabin's fragile protections, her makeshift barricades, the candle stubs, the meager rations she had saved. Outside, the world was steeped in an exhausted grey light, and the falls breathed heavily in the distance. She set off, taking care to follow the trail she had come in on, but the woods seemed to have shifted overnight. Familiar markers vanished behind walls of mist, and every tree appeared identical. Her pulse thudded painfully as the forest closed in, pressing her toward the roar she hoped to leave behind. Midway along the narrow path, Clara stopped to catch her breath. Her chest heaved, and she wiped tears from her eyes. Against her better judgment, she glanced back toward the cabin's hidden edge and froze. A pale shape stood at the window, hip deep in shadow, head tilted as if observing her departure. Its cheeks were hollow, eyes like empty wells that drew in light and hope alike. It raised a hand in a gesture of sorrowful farewell. Clara staggered back, heart pounding. The figure remained motionless, a sentinel of despair, until the wind shifted and carried it away on a swirl of mist. Fear nagged at her heels, but she pressed on, determined not to look back again. The roar of the falls grew until it was all she could hear. Clara blinked through her anxiety, scanning for the final stretch of trail, the last mark, a broken branch, tied with faded cloth, should have appeared on the road. Instead, there was nothing but an unbroken line of ancient trunks. Frustration and panic blurred together, and she realized the forest had swallowed its path. She was lost, guided only by the distant, merciless thunder of water. Twilight approached as Clara trudged deeper into the forest, branches clawing at her clothes, snagging her sleeves like desperate hands. She tried whistling for help, but even her own voice seemed muted by the oppressive hush. In the dim light, she thought she saw movement to her left, a pair of glimmering eyes reflecting her flashlight's beam. She spun the light in that direction. The eyes vanished, leaving only the darkness. Her heart seized. She took a breath and reminded herself that she had survived 4 nights here. She could survive one more if she kept moving. The sound of rushing water grew louder once more, but it felt wrong muted. Clara followed it, certain it would lead her back to the falls pool, where she could perhaps summon help. But the path curved abruptly, plunging her into a narrow ravine. The walls rose steep and slick, funneling the echo of water into a canyon of dread. Below, a smaller hidden stream cascaded over mossy ledges, its surface glittering with motes of light. In the half-dark, Clara could have sworn she heard a soft lullaby sung from just out of sight. Gooseflesh prickled along her arms. She descended carefully, clinging to wet stones and gnarled roots. The lullaby grew clearer, a gentle, sorrowful refrain that urged her onward. Clara's rational mind railed against it, but her legs moved as if compelled by a force beyond her will. The gorge narrowed until she had to squeeze through a gap barely wider than her shoulders. On the other side, she stumbled into a hidden hollow, ringed with ancient stones inscribed with indecipherable symbols. The stream widened into a still pool that mirrored the twilight sky. Clara froze, breath misting in the cold air, struck by the profound silence. Leaning over the pool's smooth surface, Clara caught her reflection. Pale, drawn, eyes wide with terror and exhaustion, she touched the water, and her fingers rippled the image into grotesque distortion. Then she heard a soft gasp from behind. Spinning around, she found herself face to face with a woman whose features were achingly familiar. Clara herself, though younger, with hope still shining in her eyes. The doppelganger's lips parted in mournful recognition. Clara's heart cramped. She stumbled back, tripping over a stone and falling to her knees. The reflection in the pool shimmered as though under disturbed water. "You shouldn't have come," her double whispered, voice echoing like wind through hollow branches. "You can't leave now." The words scraped at Clara's mind, weaving despair around her heart. She struggled to stand, the weight of untold sorrow pressing on her chest. Behind the apparition, mist coalesced into shapes. Those pale watchers from the cabin windows, hovering at the edges of her vision. They reached out with web-like hands, motionless pleas frozen on their faces. Clara's throat constricted as she realized they were dead drowned in these waters, forever bound to the false, dark embrace. Tears streamed down Clara's face as the image of her younger self reached toward her. She recoiled, voice trembling. "No, I won't stay." The hollow echo of the falls answered her defiance. The pool's surface churned, and hands emerged skeletal yet fleshless, dripping with brackish water. They grasped at the air, dragging themselves toward Clara. She scrambled backward, arm flailing until the rough stone wall provided support. Her back pressed against the cold rock as the hands crept closer, each movement a deathly promise. Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara leveled her flashlight at the advancing shapes. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing features gaunt and drowned. Their eyes, empty and imploring, stared into her soul. She turned away, stumbling toward the ravine's narrowing exit. Behind her, the hollow lullaby rose in volume, weaving an entrancing dirge that threatened to lull her into stillness. Her legs trembled as if weighed down by unseen anchors, but she forced one step after another, praying the gorge would lead her back to solid ground. Emerging from the ravine, Clara gasped at the sight before her. The cabin, perched on its cliff, glowed dimly in the gathering night. The falls thundered beside it, as ferocious as ever. She might have cried in relief, had tears not been already spent. Lightning forked overhead, illuminating the battered structure in a strobe of fractured brilliance. She realized then that the cabin had never been an escape. It was a trap, a beacon luring wanderers into this domain of sorrow. She crouched low, hiding behind a knotted tree root, unsure whether escape was still possible. The wind roared to life, carrying a chant of voices so layered they formed a tapestry of despair. Clara pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out, but each voice pierced her mind with memories she thought forgotten. The sting of loss, the cold absence of loved ones, the unbearable weight of solitude. She staggered, vision swimming, and sank to her knees as the chant crescendoed into a painful roar. In that moment, she understood that the falls demanded sacrifice to quiet their lament, and she was running out of time. Determination flickered amid her terror. Clara rose to her feet, shaking, and forced herself to run along the cliff's edge. The ground was slick with rain, and each step risked plunging her into the white churn below. The chant followed, echoing in her skull, urging her to stop. A flash of lightning revealed forms drifting in the air, figures half seen, arms outstretched in mournful welcome. She sprinted past them, breath ragged, clutching the knife at her waist like a talisman. Behind her, the cabin's windows began to glow from within, as if life had returned to that haunted place. The trail doubled back unexpectedly, winding away from the falls toward an overgrown path she had not noticed before. Clara hesitated but recognized the desperate opportunity. She dashed down that narrow corridor of trees, the branches scraping her jacket and pulling at her hair. The chant faded behind her, muffled by distance, until only the wind and her pounding heart remained. Soon she emerged into an open clearing, moonlight silvering the tops of jagged rocks. At the clearing's center stood a stone archway, cloaked in ivy, its purpose unknown. Yet it seemed to promise passage beyond. Clara approached the arch with trepidation, eyes scanning for traps. The ivy shifted, as though alive, uncurling tendrils that brushed her cheek. She shivered at its touch, cold as ice, yet pulsing with a strange vitality. Beyond the arch lay another realm. The forest continued, but the trees stood straighter and farther apart, the path beneath her feet firm and dry for the first time. She glanced back, half expecting the mist and chanting figures to spill into the clearing. But nothing followed. The arch seemed to hold the darkness at bay. Stepping through the ivy-draped portal, Clara felt as though she had crossed an invisible boundary. The air here was lighter, tinged with the scent of wildflowers and fresh pine. For the first time since her arrival, she felt her shoulders loosen. She dared to breathe deeply, realizing how tightly she had been holding on to fear. Yet a tiny voice in her mind reminded her that nothing vanished without a price. She tightened her grip on the knife, moving forward with caution, aware that safety might still be a fragile illusion. The moon climbed higher as Clara followed the newfound path. Small lanterns hung from branches, swinging gently in an unfelt breeze. Their light guided her steps, creating pools of warmth in the darkness. Occasionally, she glimpsed carved totems' faces etched into wood, expressions frozen in sorrow or rage. Each bore the same inscrutable message: the debt is unpaid. Clara's heart sank. Freedom here might be illusory. The forest still claimed what it considered owed. She pressed on, determined to find an end to this cruel tether. After what felt like endless miles, Clara reached the forest's edge. In the open air beyond, she saw the faint glow of a distant highway. Cars gliding past like fireflies in flight. Relief surged through her, tears threatening anew. She sprinted forward, the nocturnal world falling away behind her, until only asphalt and the call of engines remained. She ran onto the shoulder of the road, waving frantically at passing headlights until a car slowed, then stopped. The driver, startled, rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" he asked. Clara could only nod, voice lost in exhaustion. As dawn broke over the horizon, Clara sat in the car's passenger seat, coat wrapped tight around her. She watched the forest recede into the mist, its silhouette dark and unyielding. In her lap lay the single white feather she had found by the lantern's missing spot. The feather quivered in the early light, as though caught in an unseen draught. Clara placed it gently on the seat, uncertain whether it should stay or return to the cabin. The driver glanced at it with concern, but Clara only shook her head, eyes distant. Back in the safety of her own home days later, Clara unpacked her bag, finding the lost kettle, lot-aligned rope, and fuel lantern, every item returned as if dropped by generous hands. Yet when she opened her pack, the white feather lay waiting on top, damp and cold. She stared at it, heart twisting with dread and wonder. She placed it on her mantle, a silent monument to the nights she survived. Sleep was slow to return, and when it did, her dreams were repeatedly interrupted by the lure of water and the soft chant of the forest. Clara visited a local bookstore, seeking texts on Blackwater Falls and its legends. The librarian, eyes-weary, nodded knowingly when Clara described her experience. "Few come back unchanged," the librarian murmured, sliding an old volume across the counter. Its cover bore no title, only a symbol of a circle enclosing branching roots. Clara opened it gingerly, discovering journal entries of past travelers who vanished or returned bearing the same white feather. Each account ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though the author had been pulled under before completing their final thought. Determined to end the curse, Clara planned a return to Blackwater Falls at the next full moon. She gathered protective talismans, charms woven of cedar bark, sage to ward off harmful spirits, and salt to draw lines of safety. Friends offered concerned protests, but Clara refused to be deterred. The feather lay folded in her pocket, like a compass guiding her heart. She knew the forest's hunger would be fiercest under the full moon's glare, yet inside her burned a defiant flame. If the Falls sought tribute, she would force it to pay her back. On the night of the full moon, Clara stood once more before the ramshackle cabin. The mist curled around her ankles like living serpents. Her breath hitched as she gripped the feather and the knife. The roar of the falls thundered a defiant welcome. Clara nodded to herself, stepping forward with unshakable resolve. Tonight, she would face the sorrowed souls, confront the labyrinth of mist, and demand her freedom. For in her chest burned a courage honed by fear. and she would not leave until she claimed her escape from the whispering darkness of Blackwater Falls.